Teacher Induction Program Coordinators meeting, focusing today on the CalTPA. We designed this meeting around answering quite a few questions that come up from induction programs and induction candidates around completing the CalTPA. So we're scheduled for about 2 hours. So we've got a lot of information to go through, as you can see from the agenda. So we're going to start with our opening activities of welcoming introductions and norms. We will do a quick look at the CalTPA cycles. We'll look at some submission considerations, where to find CalTPA resources, looking at the video considerations for submissions, particularly in the time of remote settings for candidates. And we'll look at other resources that are useful for online settings. There are some flexibilities due to COVID-19 that we'll cover, and then end up with some upcoming events of note to look forward to. So Amy Rising will be joining us shortly, but my name is Zoltan Sarda. I am the lead consultant for the CalTPA with the CTC, and I'll hand that over to James next.
Good afternoon, I'm James Webb, consultant with the Performance Assessment Development Team. I am the lead consultant with the Education Specialist CalTPA, but I love to still work with my induction folks, so I'm excited to be with you today, and I'm going to turn it over to Evaluation Systems. Mary?
Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Murray Autry, the Senior Area Director for Evaluation Systems. Glad that you are all able to join us today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Also joining me is my colleague, Lori Thornley. Lori?
Hello, everyone. As Mary said, I'm part of the Pearson team or evaluation systems team located in our Sacramento office. Glad to be with you here today.
Okay, and we are getting a lot of questions about whether this is the right meeting for you and whether if you registered for it, will you be able to get the slide deck? We are going to send out the slide deck. If you don't think you're registered on a list, I'm just going to tell you a email address that you can send a query to, and we'll make sure you get on the list. It's caltpa@ctc.ca.gov. And if you'll send a request there, we'll make sure that you get a copy of this PowerPoint.
And Zoltan, I also responded to the chat. Karen Sacramento will put this the slide deck on the induction webpage at the CTC. So it will be available there most likely tomorrow or perhaps by Wednesday.
Perfect.
Also, I just want to let everyone know we are recording this session, and this will also be available on the CalTPA playlist at the at the Commission's YouTube channel. So look for that if you need to go back and see anything, or if you'd like to share with your other colleagues.
Okay. So our outcomes for the day, primarily is to understand the content of the CalTPA cycles more deeply. And what we designed this around is to think about how to understand it in terms of supporting our candidates and understanding what the requirements are. We really are going to take an approach of taking components of the CalTPA apart in a way that you might do with candidates, or that is helpful for candidates. We're going to look at some common issues that are coming up in scoring. We're going to again point to where those supports are for faculty, candidates, and coordinators. Again, we'll understand the flexibilities that are available due to COVID-19. And then we're going to do our best to answer your immediate questions. There will be periods throughout the presentation where we're going to pause for your questions, and we'll ask you to put those into the chat, and James will be monitoring the chat for us on that. James.
So we'd like to review some of our meeting norms for today, just so that we can make sure that we have a successful and smooth webinar. We'd like for you to enter your name and affiliation in the chat section for attendance. So if you would, while I'm reviewing these norms, please enter your name and the district with which you are affiliated, or if you are with a university program, please put that in. And if it is a county office of education, please put that in as well. We would like for you to use the chat feature to post questions. We'll pause at different times throughout the presentation so that we can answer them. And if we are unable to answer your question due to time constraints or something that might be a little bit more detailed, we will provide our email addresses and allow for a follow-up with email. We'd prefer if you could keep the questions to a very general focus rather than program or candidate specific. Again, those very specific, very drilled down questions may prove to be answered best through email. We do ask that you avoid multitasking during the webinar so that you hear all the information presented. We know that there's a lot going on and probably a lot of emails that are coming your way, but go ahead and just allow yourself to have this time for the webinar so that you can hear all the information presented and focus on this. And we do want to honor the time for our participants and our presenters by moderating your participation time. Please remember, we have several people right now. We have over 50 folks in our webinar, and so we just want to make sure that we're able to address all the questions. And then a norm that's not up here, but as a reminder, we are recording this session. So I'll turn it back to Zoltan.
Okay, so just a general question here to start. Why does California require a teaching performance assessment? It's really focused on candidates demonstrating the teaching performance expectation for California teachers. I like to think of it as the assessment is signaling a disposition towards what good teaching is about. We don't expect that a teacher is going to perform beyond what a beginning teacher is capable of in these performance assessments. But again, that idea of Cycle 1 being focused on understanding who your students are, what their assets are, and what their learning needs are, and planning learning experiences for those. And then Cycle 2, really designing assessments that drive instructional planning. And as we all know, those are just the hallmarks of good teaching. And so we're really looking at assessing the degree to which young teachers are capable of doing that, but also signaling what good teaching is through the assessment.
And Zoltan, Amy Rising has joined us, so we'd like to introduce Amy. So Amy, if you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself to our participants.
Thank you, James. And hello, everyone. I apologize for being a little late. Happy to be here with you this afternoon and looking forward to answering all of your questions. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, so I'll take this one. I think
Sure.
I'll take the next couple, Amy. Good to see you.
Yes.
Okay, so just a big overview here. The idea of the CalTPA structure is that there's 2 cycles. Each cycle has 4 steps. So again, instructional cycle 1 is learning about students and planning instruction. They go through a series of planning, teaching and assessing, reflecting on what happened in that lesson, and then applying what was learned in that lesson, and then thinking about what they would do in future lessons the same topic. The same 4 steps apply for instructional cycle 2, which is assessment-driven instruction. Again, plan, teach and assess, reflect, and apply. We brought up an example of the rubric here. Again, this is part of that spot of how can we help our candidates understand the process once they have submitted their submissions in order to understand how to best prepare for it. So again, this is the example rubric that we have from Cycle 1, from the planning cycle. At the top, the essential question for the rubric is an important piece to remind candidates of. We're going to show you a little bit later how that can be broken down and formed into questions that candidates can evaluate their own submissions through by looking at those essential questions. But if we go to the next slide, James. I always think it's good for when we're submitting an assessment to think about how does the assessor look at what's done. And so the process for an assessor is when they get a submission, they go through a scoring process flow. And so what they do is they start with level 3 on a particular rubric, and then they look at each of the constructs there. And so this level 3 for 1.1 has 4 constructs, and they look for evidence to make sure that there's evidence for each one of those. They only need one piece of evidence, and it can be found through all the planning documents. But if they find that there is evidence for each of those constructs, then they go on to level 4, and so on for level 5. So when they get to level 4, if not all the constructs are there, if there's 3 constructs for level 4 and there's only 2, then that submission will be scored as a 3. If they start at level 3 and all the constructs are not there, then they drop to a level 2 and they do the same process, but the inverse of that. So going down by each step. The important thing for candidates to know is that all of these constructs need to be found in their submission for this rubric. And there needs to be evidence that can be pointed to, can be seen related to each of those constructs. I think it's a really useful thing for candidates to just know what that process is like and how a scorer goes through that. Okay. Amy, you want to take this one?
Sure. So we wanted to be sure that you were aware that Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 are constructed slightly differently. So in Cycle 1, there are 8 analytic rubrics that the candidate receives feedback on. And Cycle 1 is as simple as this. It is about one lesson for either literacy or mathematics, and the candidate is checking for understanding during that lesson. So they're using informal assessment. So it's instruction and assessment for one lesson, one group of students. There are 3 video clips that the candidate identifies out of their lesson, and they annotate those. And then it takes 19 points across those 8 rubrics to pass. So we wanted to point that out. And then Cycle 2 is a little bit more complex in nature and is typically done second and comes later in the teacher development program. And of course, now these candidates are with you in induction, so it is beyond their teacher preliminary preparation program. But in Cycle 2, there are 9 rubrics, so 1 extra rubric. Cycle 2 focuses on 3 to 5 lessons with 3 types of classroom assessment: informal, student self-assessment, and formal assessment. The candidate is asked to identify 5 video clips in Cycle 2 and annotate them, and it's 21 points to pass Cycle 2. Candidates do need to engage in both cycles, and they need to pass both cycles to complete the entire performance assessment. When the candidate completes an assessment cycle, which is typically about a 4 to 6 week experience for a candidate, when they complete all the evidence they need to gather, they then submit it. And when it gets submitted into the system, it goes out to an assessor over the system. And the assessor takes a look at it and begins to do the scoring process, just like Zoltan explained to you, where they start at level 3 and they look for all the constructs depending on the evidence that's associated with that rubric. Now, when something goes amiss and a candidate forgets to, they're not going to forget to submit something because the system won't let the submission go through unless everything is in its place. But let's say they upload the wrong document for a slot. Then when the assessors are looking at that, if they see something amiss, they forward it on to what is called the lead assessor. And that lead assessor then might assign a condition code, which means that we could not score the candidate's work because something was missing. And then the code is assigned and that gets sent back to the candidate. So it could be that, as you can see, these common errors, they submitted the wrong cycle or step in the wrong place. They put evidence in the wrong place, and we can't then understand what they've sent to us. The video or audio clips are not continuous and unedited, or they're not playable, or we can't hear people, the candidate or the children involved in the clip. And so there are condition codes for that kind of technical error. If the number of students that need to be seen in the videos are not there, then we have to assign a condition code. And I can tell you that this third bullet is really a product of COVID and the change in our instructional settings. We started to see some very strange things happening where, for example, we had things come forward to us where clearly the candidate was teaching the neighborhood children, or the children in the class were maybe their own children, et cetera. So we had to be very specific about the number of students in a clip, and the candidate has to be seen. And we'll cover that in some slides that are coming up. We already talked about the uploaded or things are missing and the incorrect file. So these are all the kinds of common errors we're seeing from candidates. And we really hope that candidates slow down and check their work before they hit the submit button to really make sure that the video clip they've uploaded is in fact the video clip they want to submit and not a video clip from their vacation. We have actually seen that happen sometimes. Anyway, we do want you to know that if we do receive evidence that is not scorable, we do not make any leaps of faith. We don't score the work. We send it back to the candidate with a condition code. And you can find these condition codes on the website, and we'll tell you where to find those. So now we're just going to go into general Q&A. James, do we have any questions in the chat?
Not yet.
Okay, well, we can pause for a second. If you have any questions, you can either unmute and ask your question, or you can put it in the chat.
There's one that just came in. Is NA a condition code?
Not applicable? Is that what that NA stands for?
I believe so.
So no, each condition code is sort of content-based. It has a specific technical error assigned to it.
Amy, I think Lori may be referring to the final tally on a score report. If a candidate receives condition codes on their score report, the final status for that cycle will show as NA.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Is that what
perfect.
you meant, Lori?
Yes, she said thank you.
Okay, perfect. Yes, and that is a good way to know without asking your candidate directly. When you get the score reports at the preliminary program level, you can see that NA in there for candidates that got condition codes. Go ahead, James.
Thank you. Another question came in from Jake, thinking to PE and what a weight training session could look like when the students are at home and have no access to equipment.
I guess my question would be, how is it weight training if the kids have no access to weight training equipment? I wonder if you could rephrase your question and maybe we could be helpful.
Yeah, sorry, excuse me. Okay, can I mute myself? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so just because, you know, I teach physical education at the high school level, and I do have kids enrolled in my physical education classes and my weight training classes, and I have to manipulate and, you know, basically make adjustments to my curriculum. But I'm wondering how I can basically run a PE lesson virtually for that's okay for the CalTPA to be approved. Like, what are you guys seeing like on the board and stuff when you guys are scoring for people that are turning in physical education lessons when the students don't have any access to equipment or basketballs, soccer balls, footballs, you know, sports equipment. So I was just kind of wondering, what are you guys seeing, or how are you guys scoring those PE lessons, you know, when it's happening like that?
I can take this one.
Okay, James, and maybe you can advise him about office hours, please.
Right, yes, we do have office hours for candidates on Wednesdays at 4:15. So that might be a good time to come in, because we also got another question, Amy, about recording students. But one of the things that we have seen, and I've actually seen it in my own son's PE program, is that the teacher is using calisthenic type activities, also aerobic activities, and then students are recorded. Now, in this situation, the students do have permission to be recorded, And then the PE teacher will provide feedback to the students. Also, there is information about what are some techniques that are provided to the students. And so weight training might be a challenge unless you are in a situation where there are small cohorts on campus, but it might be that the information presented might be something of a, what I just explained with aerobic exercises, possibly even, the opportunity to instruct if it's basketball, doing some type of information like that. And so that, I think, may cover two of the questions. We will put in the, somebody had asked about the Zoom link for office hours. Lori, could you put that? Because if I go out of this, I will actually mess up the PowerPoint. So could you put the office
Sure.
hours in for candidates?
I will find it and put it in.
Okay, and then also somebody had asked about PE lesson being a health lesson for heart health or circulatory system. As long as it is correlated to the California State PE standards, it will be an acceptable lesson. Remember that it needs to be content-based, so it needs to be in the PE standards. So we want to make sure that that is there. So I think we have some other questions that I can go ahead, because I know we have a lot of information. So some questions I'll be able to respond to in the chat, but let's go ahead and continue so that we stay on our time.
And I did just see a question from Asia about candidate office hours. Candidate office hours will remain every week. It is only program office hours that will be moving to bi-monthly. So are there any other questions about the cycles from induction coaches, mentors, directors, or others that you might have questions?
I saw a question here about locating the documents. A little bit later, Lori is going to run us through that.
Okay, great.
I think this is you, Amy.
And then this slide, just we wanted to let you know, because today in the 2 hours that we have together with you, we may not get to all of your questions, but if you really want a very detailed walkthrough on the Commission's YouTube channel, we have what we call deep dive presentations that we've recorded that you can access and literally be walked through every step of each of the 2 cycles with a further discussion. So this may be helpful to you, and you can find them at this youtube.com web address.
You want me to take this one, Amy? Or
sure, or I can.
yeah, okay.
All right, so we wanted to just go ahead and dive into Cycle 1 a bit here and walk you through it. So remember, Cycle 1's title is Learning About Students and Planning Instruction. The focus here is on instructional planning with some checking for understanding and 3 focus students. So please go to the next slide. So in step 1 of plan, there are some key directions for candidates that we wanted to share with you. So what the candidate is doing is they're finding out information, important contextual information about the students in front of them that they are teaching. And it was written for 1 class of students, but as we explained during COVID, people are teaching under different settings. And so we have some flexibility there that we will talk specifically about. But the intention of Cycle 1 was to watch a teacher candidate teach a class of students. And they are teaching them a content specific lesson. And that lesson is either mathematics or it's literacy. There can be integrated instruction coming into that literacy lesson or into that math lessons where perhaps you're combining math and science or literacy and social science. All that is fine, but they must be content specific lessons and they must be based on the California Student Academic Content Standards. And if a candidate has a student in their group that they're teaching and they happen to be an English learner, then they need to have an English learner development goal as well as a content goal. And then if you look on the right side, we have some very specific aspects that we're looking for. So here are some questions that you need to think about and work with your candidates on. So does the candidate's proposed learning goals connect with prior knowledge and define specific outcomes for the students? So again, remember, they're either teaching a literacy lesson or they're teaching a mathematics-based lesson. It can be integrated with other subject matter areas. And we need to look at that learning goal, and we need to understand, what is this lesson based on? What did the students learn before about the content before they come into this lesson for this cycle? The second thing we need to be looking for and helping candidates think about is, what learning activities and instructional and grouping strategies are they going to put in place in this lesson so that they can support, engage, and challenge all the students in their class to meet the learning goals. So in the contextual piece, they're telling us about the students' assets and their learning needs, and we need to see in the lesson that the candidate is addressing that through their activities and their grouping strategies. And then finally, in the lesson, we're looking for how the candidate is planning instruction using the knowledge of the 3 focus students' assets and learning needs to support that engagement. So they're thinking about the whole class, but within the whole class, they're thinking about 3 specific focus students that Zoltan will talk about in a minute. And we need to see how the candidate can think about both things simultaneously. How are they working with the class? How are they working with the individual students? And how are they providing an asset-based lesson? Very important. So that is step 1, planning, and it looks at, and it has 4 rubrics: rubric 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. The first rubric looks overall at planning, and then 2, 3, and 4 look at the specific focus students.
And if we look at,
oh, I'm sorry.
and if we look at this, this slide here, so what we've done is we've taken apart the step. So on the left, it's what the candidate needs to do. And the right side, we have deconstructed the essential questions, and frame them as questions for the candidate. So, for a candidate to say, have I done that? By taking that essential question, those essential questions apart, I think it's a useful way for them to do some self-assessment on where they are with their submission. The third bullet point on this one, the 3 of the rubrics for step 1 are related to focus students. And this is sort of the general focus of those 3, rubric 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4, is that have they really understood the assets and learning needs of 3 focus students and planned instruction, meaningful instruction for them to support their needs. Hey, James, you had a point.
Yes, thank you, Zoltan. I just want to ask a clarifying question. So the literacy or mathematics focus, that's for multiple subject candidates, correct? If the candidate is single subject, it's content-based. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think also the 3 bullets could also be used by mentors when they are working with their candidates as coaching questions. Would that be a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, so just to go back to James's point, we apologize for not clarifying that on the screen, but if it is a single subject candidate, the 2 instructional cycles need to be 2 different lessons within the content area for the single subject credential they're pursuing. So that is a good point.
Okay, so for step 2, the teach and assess, the evidence for this is going to be the videos that they submit for each cycle, and the annotations that they have incorporated into their videos. That's what the assessors look at for this step. So what they're going to do is that they're going to teach the planned lesson to students and video record that lesson. They're going to select and annotate clips from the video that illustrate specific teaching practices and strategies. And there are 4 areas that they need to document for cycle 1. Have they created a positive and safe learning environment? Have they explained connections to prior learning and set expectations for content-specific learning? Have they engaged students in higher order thinking? And have they monitored student understanding through the assessment? Again, on the right side, we've deconstructed the essential questions from the 2 rubrics, from rubrics 1.5 and 1.6. And again, just as that reflective piece. for the candidate. Have I maintained, demonstrated a positive and safe learning environment that supports all students? Have I connected the students to prior learning? So what came before this? Have I established clear learning expectations? Have I actively engaged students in deep learning of content? So are the students actively engaged as opposed to passively receiving content? And then is there monitoring and assessing of the student understanding as the lesson proceeds? And then finally, and we are seeing candidates having a lowered score for this piece, have they established next steps for learning? So one of the pieces here, not what is the next assignment, but what is the next learning in the sequence that's to come, that's based on what they've done in the current lesson. So.
All right, and that brings us to step 3, reflect. So in step 3, reflect, the candidate is thinking back to step 1, planning, and to step 2, where they're teaching the lesson and video recording. So the candidate needs to provide information on drawing from those student assets and learning to plan that appropriate, relevant, and rigorous lesson for the class. And then they need to explain how that lesson plan was flexible to incorporate in the moment adaptations for students. And they need to indicate what they would need to do to support focused students as they're going forward. And then in rubric 1.7 specifically, as they're checking their work before they submit it for scoring, the candidate can ask themselves these questions. And as James pointed out, these would be good coaching questions. So does the candidate analyze and describe the impact of their asset and needs-based lesson planning, teaching, and assessment of student learning? Do they do that? Do they go back to step 1 and think about their planning? Do they go back to step 2 and watch their videos and think about what happened? And does then the second bullet, does the candidate explain how the lesson supported the whole class and the 3 individual focus students? Because they need to speak to both of that in their reflection. And then finally, so important here, the candidate cannot introduce new information in their reflection. They need to cite exactly what happened in their planning step and in their teaching and assessing steps. So steps 1 and 2. And they need to go back and talk about that lesson planning process and those assets and learning needs of their students and their 3 focus students. And then also what happened when they actually taught the lesson. And reflect on what they might do differently next time, for example, or what they learned from a particular focus student and how they might have extended the learning and helped that candidate, that student, reach the learning goal. So reflection really does need to be reflection and not just a retelling of the steps.
And again,
there's just one rubric here on this step, and Zoltan.
Yeah, and I think going back to that idea that the TPA is modeling good teaching. You know, good teachers know why they're doing what they're doing, and they have evidence to understand where their students are in their learning. And so to really get candidates to be in that mode of what is the evidence for these decisions that I'm making with my students is an important piece. So finally, step 4 is the apply. So they've gone through a reflection process on what happened in the lesson. And in step 4, they are going to explain what they would do differently in advance to advance the learning of the class if they were to teach this lesson again. And what would you do? What would they do to the same or differently to improve learning for the whole class? So would they modify? Would they keep it the same? And again, that question of why. Why would they do that? So again, these reflective questions for the candidate. Does the candidate explain how they will apply what they have learned in Cycle 1 about students learning to strengthen and extend students' understanding of content and academic language? Does the candidate determine next steps for instruction? And again, does the candidate cite evidence from steps 1, 2, and or 3 in their explanation? Okay, and we are going to pause after this for more questions, but we're going to go through quickly again through Cycle 2.
Just to let you know, I am answering questions as they come up in the chat. So I think we're okay right now, but it's good that you added that checkpoint. So thank you.
Thanks, James. So cycle 2, assessment driven instruction. Do you want to take this one, Amy?
Sure. So again, in cycle 2, the title helps us understand what the cycle is focused on. And this time it's that understanding of how a teacher candidate uses classroom-based assessment to understand what to do next in their teaching as they work with their students. So assessment-driven instruction. So in step 1, again, we have our 4 steps: plan, teach and assess, reflect, and apply. In step 1 plan, we have 2 rubrics, 2.1 and 2.2. So as promised, cycle 2 is more complex, more comprehensive than cycle 1, because now we are looking at 3 to 5 content-specific lessons. Again, if you're a multiple subjects candidate, if you did literacy in cycle 1, you're doing mathematics in cycle 2, or vice versa. If you're a single subject candidate, you're doing the same content area, but different lessons, so that you can show us that full breadth of experience. And again, 3 to 5 lessons. It's up to the candidate to decide. Do they want to talk about 3 lessons, 4 lessons, or 5? And they need to be conducted over time so that we can see that growth on the part of the students in those assessments that they're being given. And we need to be looking at how candidates are developing academic language and addressing the language needs of their students. And also, very importantly, somewhere in those 3 to 5 lessons, the candidate needs to be showing us how students are using educational technology to further their understanding of the content. So that is an important addition in cycle 2 as well. So a couple of reflection questions that are based on the essential questions here for rubrics 2.1 and 2.2. So does the candidate's learning plan, their learning segment template plan, so they're not giving us full lesson plans in cycle 2, they're giving us a description of what's happening in each of the lessons. So does that learning segment plan provide appropriate content specific and, if appropriate, ELD learning goals and assessments that offer multiple ways for all students to demonstrate knowledge? So that multiple ways is really important. We're looking for candidates to apply universal design for your learning, UDL, strategies here, so that all students have access to the content they're teaching and are developing academic language. So the second point is, does the candidate plan a learning segment in which assessments, instructional strategies, and activities align and provide a progression of learning? So across those 3 to 5 lessons, are we seeing that arc of connected learning and assessment? And that also in step 1, candidates submit their 3 assessments. So informal assessments, those checking for understanding types of strategies. Also a student self-assessment with a rubric, and a formal assessment with a rubric across those 3 to 5 lessons. And that is step 1, planning.
Okay, so we have 2 slides here for the teach and assess, as there are 5 rubrics for step 2 in cycle 2. So for this, the process is similar. They're going to select and submit 4 video clips that show themselves and the students engaged in assessment strategies embedded in instruction. And again, they are going to write annotations describing what they're doing and the rationale for why you're doing it. And again, we've bolded the what and the why. This is very important in submissions, that we want to see that candidates know what they're doing and why they're doing that. And the annotations for the teach and assess are related to assessing student learning and development of academic language, students using educational technology, providing content-specific feedback to students, and student learning and use of higher order thinking skills. And again, so the questions here for the self-reflection questions: do I demonstrate supporting student development and demonstration of academic language in relation to the content-specific learning goals? And have I incorporated educational technology to provide opportunities for the students to achieve and demonstrate content-specific learning? One of the things that we need to look for with that ed tech is that the students are using it to further their learning. They're not just observing what the teacher is doing with ed tech. So the use of Zoom, participating in Zoom, does not qualify as them engaging in using educational technology to advance their learning. And again, in our office hours, a lot of questions come up about these kinds of specifics. So we really encourage you to join those office hours, and candidates share ideas. Lots of folks share ideas in those meetings. So we can go to the next slide. So on the left, it's all the same. The rest are the questions from taking apart the essential questions from rubrics 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7. These are related to the assessment phase of this work. So for the candidate to ask himself, have I used informal assessments to monitor students' understanding of content and to adjust the instruction to meet the needs of all the learners? So that idea that I have flexible lesson planning from like I did in cycle 1, but I'm also adjusting as we go by doing some informal assessments. The candidates need to engage the students in self-assessment as well to build their awareness of what they have learned and support that progress toward learning goals. So have I demonstrated that? And then finally, have I used results of the informal assessments to provide feedback to students about how to improve or revise their work? A little bit later, we're going to get into some of the things we're seeing in the videos and the submissions, and so a few tips on how to tackle particularly the self-assessment. We get a lot of questions around that and self-assessment for younger students as well.
All right, and that brings us to the next step in the cycle, which is reflect. And again, there is one rubric that is scored for reflection. The candidate is again to go back and consider what happened in step 1, planning, and step 2, teach and assess. And the rubric measures student performance of the learning goals that they are using. In cycle 2, it's slightly different in reflect. In reflect, they're looking at their formal assessment work, and they're thinking about what they've learned from their assessments. They're going to summarize student results on the formal assessment for the whole class, and then submit 3 individual student formal assessment responses. So in this step, they are reflecting on student work, and they're reflecting particularly here in this step on the formal assessment responses. And they need to submit 3 pieces of student work that are either a process, product, or performance. If it's a performance, then they would be 3 video clips perhaps. But we need to see the work of a student who exceeded the learning goal set in the 3 to 5 lessons, a student who met the learning goals, and then a student who has not yet met the learning goals set for the lesson or lessons. And then in the rubric for 2.8, we're looking for how the candidate analyzed the formal assessment results using the rubric they wrote for the students. Right, so we have a formal assessment, students submit their product, process, or performance, and the candidate uses the rubric they wrote to score that work. And then did the candidate identify and describe emerging learning patterns and trends for the whole class, using again the language of that formal assessment rubric that they developed? And then finally, does the candidate determine what was most and least effective in relation to the learning goals? So looking again here at how a candidate thinks about formal assessment and the use of a rubric with their students and how they provide that feedback to their students. And I think that takes us to the next step.
Step 4 to apply. So for cycle 2, we're again asking them to look at the assessment results. This is really bringing in that idea of what is the evidence for their decision making. And so based on their analysis, are they going to do a reteaching activity with a different instructional approach for the students who didn't meet the learning goals? Or are they going to create an extension activity that builds on what they demonstrated in the series of lessons that they had gone through with their students? So again, those reflective questions. Have I analyzed the results from all three kinds of assessment, informal assessment, student self-assessment, and the formal assessments, to plan and teach the follow-up learning activity and provide a rationale for the activity choice? So what's the rationale for a reteaching activity, or what is the rationale for an extension activity? And then again, that idea of citing the evidence from steps 1, 2, and or 3 in their explanation. How are they bringing that forward into their description of what they are planning to do as next steps? Okay, and I see we've had a lot of questions in the chat that James has been following up on. So let's take a couple moments here, see if there's some other, we're going to get into some tips on these cycles as well in the next segment.
Amy, I
Yes.
did get a question, but I think maybe it might be good if you spoke to this. Candidates do have 5 years on their credential to complete their performance assessment requirement. And so if there is a concern by the district with regard to video recording students, or it's not allowed, what would be the idea? Is that the candidate would wait until their district allows that, in terms of fulfilling
Right.
this requirement for
All right.
induction?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first I want to clarify that if you're a teacher in a teacher preparation program, you're completing your teaching performance assessment, hopefully in your program. If you cannot complete it because you cannot video record and you cannot conduct instruction in a synchronous manner, then you're going to wait and you're going to get that executive order preliminary credential, right? So if we're talking about candidates that have come into induction and you have that executive order preliminary credential, and it says on your document that you need to complete the TPA, you're going to be in your induction program getting support from induction. And in that case, yes, absolutely, James, that preliminary credential is good for 5 years. So the candidate has up to 5 years to complete whatever requirements are on that credential to clear it. So for candidates coming into their first employment and enrolling in induction programs, they could have on their credential statement, on their preliminary credential, that they need to complete a TPA and pass it. And maybe they even need to pass RECA. And we'll talk about that later a little bit as well. But if they have and hold a preliminary credential and they have been employed to teach and they are in induction, we're hoping that they can complete their assessment and pass it in those first 2 years while they're in induction and getting support. They might need to stay in induction for a 3rd year, but absolutely the credential is good for 5 years. And the only way you can then clear that preliminary credential is if you have taken and passed the TPA. So yes, specifically, you have a 5-year time clock to pass the TPA.
Okay.
And it looks like there's some hands up. Maybe James, you can call on people if you can see everybody,
So
or they can
Marsha
put their
Russell,
question in the chat.
yeah, Marsha Russell has her hand up. Marsha, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you so much. I just heard you say something, Amy, about they might need to stay a 3rd year in induction. If somebody has not completed the TPA or during induction, do we need to keep them in induction?
Well, the question is, how are you going to apply for their clear credential?
So the way we've done it in the past, just like anybody else, with another requirement that they have to complete, that they've never been required to complete those requirements. It's never been a requirement to complete them during induction. So if somebody didn't complete it during induction, we provide them with, you have this course or this requirement, these additional credential requirements. We have them submit their verification once they complete. So they complete it on their own after induction, submit to us, and then we recommend them. So my assumption was the same thing would happen with TPA.
Well, it just depends. I mean, these are entry-level requirements. And so if they're still not able to pass the TPA by the time they're through an induction program, part of the induction program's responsibility is to make sure the candidate is ready to continue to teach. So it's really a call on your part. Some programs are more flexible than others and can continue to support candidates beyond the 2 years. That's absolutely and always has been an option. And so really it's, you are the program making the recommendation for a candidate. So it is your responsibility to determine whether they're ready for that clear credential. And you're right, they have obligations to complete requirements sometimes, and they need to do that. In some cases, they should do it independently. Teaching performance assessment was developed to be done with support. So it's really, you know, we'd like to think that candidates were getting support from their programs as they came through this work, and that they were getting the opportunity to have someone else review their work and provide that coaching and asking those hard critical questions. At least peer review is happening. So that's why we say, you know, if you have the luxury and you have the interest and you have the opportunity to continue to support a new teacher as they continue to grow and develop, then great, they can stay in induction. But it really is going to be a candidate by candidate call.
Thanks, that's really helpful. We very much agree, and maybe it's a separate conversation I can have offline. I'm just getting confused by the suggestion to remind them they have 5 years. We've been actually recommending strongly that our candidates use the university extra hired support that we've hired to help them complete TPA now during induction, because if they're separate, that's going to be a greater challenge. But I'm trying to balance that. It should be the candidate's choice versus us as an induction program trying to encourage them to do this now and not wait until later. So I can take that offline later. Thank you. I think we're on the same page though in terms of.
Yeah. I mean, we would prefer that they do it during induction, but technically, the preliminary, right, the clock is for 5 years. But we would prefer that they do it during induction. But if you are a candidate who's still in a placement where there is no video recording allowed, then that's a problem. You can't complete the TPA if you can't do synchronous instruction and video record. So that's why there's a little bit of that flexibility there for time, but we can talk more offline if that would be helpful to you.
Yeah, I would, I think. And I saw Phoebe's comment here. It sounds similar to my question around just the different guidance. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Amy, just to let you know and others, Karen Sacramento has joined us.
Oh, great.
So Karen, if you would like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself, we're at a place with, I'm sorry, for questions. And so I thought this would be a good time for you to unmute and welcome you to our webinar.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Sacramento, consultant at the Commission, and I work primarily with teacher induction programs.
And we're getting a lot of very specific candidate questions. And I would just remind everyone, if you have a specific question, please email those questions to the Commission. I did also put in the chat that if it is a credential specific question, those questions needs to go to credentials@ctc.ca.gov because we are limited in time, unfortunately. I'm so sorry, but sometimes these questions, even though they may have simple, they have maybe 20 different components that we need to think about. So with that, if Amy, I'm going to have us go ahead and move forward.
I do see a real quick question that we can answer, which is when does the 5-year preliminary credential begin, I think is the question. And the date is on the credential. So you would check you can go online and pull up anyone's credential by entering their information. You can see their credential they were issued and the date would be on the credential. So it'd be 5 years from when the credential was issued.
Okay, so we're getting into some tips. These have come from submissions we've been reviewing and particularly around remote learning. And some of these ideas have come out of the office hours that we've talked about from candidates themselves. So we're going to move through these. And again, this presentation will be available as a resource. So let's move to the next slide, James. Do you want to take this one, Amy?
Sure. So we have learned a lot this year, and we want to share some of that learning with you as you work with your candidates. So a couple of things that we would encourage you to do as you engage with your candidates. So first of all, candidates should really become familiar with the rubrics of the instructional cycles during their writing and editing. So they should be introduced to those rubrics and aware of those rubrics as they're engaging in the work, so that they can go back and do like a self-assessment and check as they're moving along through developing their evidence to make sure that they're addressing all of those different aspects of level 3 is what we always encourage candidates to do. Really understand what is asked for at the level 3 point of the rubric and make sure that your evidence is supporting those constructs. And you do absolutely, candidates must be reminded of this over and over. They must absolutely use California standards for their subject or grade. And they are checked. And we do look at that. And so it really is important that your teacher candidates are aware of the Department of Education in California. They're aware of the California standards for students in California, and they're basing their lessons on those student standards. The third bullet speaks to encouraging candidates to review responses to ensure that they're not simply restating the prompt, but are actually answering the question. And explaining their thoughts and findings. We're really looking at the way a beginning teacher thinks about their practice. So having comprehensive, thoughtful responses is the way to go. Just giving us back the language of the prompt is not going to help the candidate provide evidence to get on the rubric at a score level of 3, right? So they need to really answer the prompt and be thoughtful and be detailed in their responses. And then finally, candidates need to engage with their students in learning, really engage with them. And the way we wrote this suggestion here is, we need to see them engaging with students in learning rather than lecturing at them. So we know that when they moved out of in-person learning to online settings, candidates were learning a lot about online settings. But we also know, because we have lots of online learning going on, that online learning can be very engaging and can get into that higher order thinking of evaluating and synthesizing and analyzing and transfer. So we really want to see that kind of instruction. Standing in the front of the room and lecturing, or sitting in a Zoom room lecturing, is not going to help the candidate have that depth and breadth of their instruction that we need to see to get them up to the higher levels of the rubric. So please encourage them to engage in learning rather than lecturing. Next slide, please.
Actually, before we move on, Amy, I put into the chat where you can find information around the rubrics and other items by going to ctcexams.nestinc.com to find that information as well.
Yeah, and we will cover some of that information as we get into later slides.
Perfect.
So back to you, Zoltan. I think you're going to share some specific observations.
Yes, okay, so a few specific observations for Cycle 1. Part of creating a submission is to help the assessor know and understand where things are located. For the candidate to be really clear about what is required and to be very deliberate about how those items are placed, those pieces are placed into their submission, helps the score. And so the idea of, in the first video, for them to review prior knowledge, that seems to be the logical place. That it doesn't have to be the first part of the lesson, but if it's that the clip is focusing on, but if it is located in there, that makes sense to assessors. And then that establishing next steps. If that clip 3 is focused on the end of the lesson, establishing next steps would be useful in that phase. It doesn't mean that's a requirement, but just thinking about where is it most clearly stated and obvious for an assessor to take a look at. We can go to the next one.
So we're going to move on to Cycle 2 and talk about some observations there. So in the self-assessment work, this is an area that's new for a lot of educators, but we've made great strides forward around self-assessment in the last several years. So self-assessment must be student-centered. It's the student who's critiquing their own work, and students should use feedback to determine their own next steps. So the goal is for students to learn how to monitor their own learning. So they're looking at their own performance or the product they've just developed or the process they're going through to solve an equation, let's say in math. And they need to be able to understand what they know and what they do not yet know so that they can ask for help and support and think about next steps they need to take themselves in their own learning. So that's important. It's around the student being able to monitor their own learning. And then student work in cycle 2. The candidate does have to submit 3 examples of student work that was formally assessed using a rubric that the teacher candidate had developed. And that feedback needs to be provided to students using the rubric language that they've developed. Sometimes we see candidates have a really amazing formal assessment of students. Let's say they're putting on a performance. We're seeing 3 video clips of 3 different students engaged in that performance. And then the teacher candidate gives them feedback. But when we look at the rubric the teacher candidate submitted, it's not related to the rubric. It's sort of a disconnect. We're not sure why candidates do that, but make sure and help students have everything aligned. The formal assessment should be conducted with the rubric, and then the students should get feedback based on what that rubric says. And then finally, the learning segment template. This is how they tell us about their 3 to 5 lessons in cycle 2. Candidates should provide that plan and that learning segment template for their 3 to 5 lessons. It's their choice, 3 lessons, 4 lessons, or 5 lessons. And they should tell us about that in the detail at which we've asked for it in the learning segment template, which is just a way for them to give us that information without them having to retype all the questions. So next slide, James,
Okay.
and then back to you, Zoltan.
Yeah, and so some of the things that we're seeing, we just want to highlight in terms of student self-assessment. The big idea here is that some candidates are being marked down because the student self-assessment is not based on content-specific learning goals. So we are seeing several, particularly in lower grades, where people have submitted scales that are focused on their feelings. And this is an important piece. In your classroom, we want students to sort of assess their emotional responses and how they're doing emotionally to what's going on in the classroom, but this is not based on content. So these kinds of scales that are focused on how do I feel about what I did, those are not considered to be rubrics that are content focused. So we are encouraging folks to not use those. If we can go to the next one. We are also seeing, rather than rubrics, people submitting checklists. And checklists, again, are a very useful thing for students to keep track of the requirements of a series of lessons or a unit, and the things that they have to do coming up and whether they have started it, whether it's in process or completing it. But again, those are not rubrics. Those are sort of checklists on procedural things, on what has to be done still. So this would not count as a rubric either. So we're encouraging folks to not use those. This next slide is, this was from a submission, a middle school example of what we're defining as a rubric. So on the left axis, the left vertical axis, there are content-specific outcomes down that axis. We use the word constructs with the rubrics in the teaching performance assessment. And again, these are constructs. So the idea is to what degree has the student stated their opinion and identified their opinion? Have they used text evidence? And what is the quantity and the quality of the evidence? Those are 3 outcomes or constructs that the students can then see how well they're doing. So again, across the horizontal axes, we want to see what are the levels of performance with descriptors. So if you saw the other rubrics, they didn't have descriptors, they were just check boxes. They didn't have information about what the learning was about. This rubric actually had, this is just a portion of it, it had 6 constructs in it, and when we get to the part about video 4, we can refer back to this piece. Again, in my teaching career, I was a kindergarten and first grade teacher. I know that for that age group, I would not be giving them a 6 construct rubric to look at with lots of text on it, but I might give them, because I want them to understand that when I look at my performance, that I can choose a particular outcome that I'm focusing on, something like making up rhymes, and I can assess it based on my performance. So this idea of I'm doing well because I can rhyme 4 words or more with no help from anybody. I'm doing okay because I can rhyme some of the words if my teacher helps me, or I'm not sure where I am because I don't know what a rhyme is yet. 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds can do this. And so again, it wouldn't be developmentally appropriate to give a kindergartner or a first grader a lot of text to look at, but they can be supported through understanding a rubric like this. And then for video 4 in cycle 2, we're getting a lot of questions about, there are 3 things that the candidates need to demonstrate in that 5 minutes. And we're getting a lot of questions about how this can be done. So they have to model for students how to understand the self-assessment or a portion. So again, going back to that earlier rubric that had 6 lines on it, you would not be able to really model how to use 6 to evaluate yourself on 6 constructs in 5 minutes. I would also argue that even if you're not recording yourself, introducing students to 6 separate constructs in a short period of time is probably not going to be helpful for them. So model a portion of it. Maybe you're going to model 1 or 2 or 3 of those lines for the students to understand what the construct is and what the levels of performance are. I think you can do that with a group of students in 1 to 2 minutes. Then you're having 1 or more students assessing their learning using the rubric or a portion, again, a portion of the rubric. When the video requirements state 1 or more students, you could have 1 student demonstrate the use of that and doing a self-assessment on that piece. And then finally, providing feedback. I think that some of the candidates are thinking that they need to do a separate assessment to provide feedback on. In the design of this, it's what is the feedback based on how they self-assess, how they use that assessment to self-assess. So this idea of, yes, you're right on. I think you are accurate in your thinking on the assessment, but what about, and maybe you should add this piece. So giving them another piece of information to consider is feedback. Asking them for evidence. You said that you're at this level here. What is the evidence for that? I think that's also a form of feedback. This is not a comprehensive list here, but these are the kinds of things that can happen in this video clip. Or to give them feedback on next steps. So here's some things that you might want to do to move your learning forward or to move your work forward based on what you said in your 2-minute self-evaluation of where you are in your learning. So I think that candidates are often thinking with this third piece that I have to do some other kind of assessment in that 5-minute clip and give them feedback on that, but it's actually based on what they say and how they use the self-assessment tool that you have provided them. And I think this is
all right. So I'm going to pick it back up here. Hopefully those tips on the student self-assessment questions are helpful. And remember, student self-assessment is something we're looking for candidates to do with their students so that student voice can be included in the learning process. And this is happening in cycle 2. So we're going to go back now, though, to be very clear about what we're looking for in these video clips in cycle 1 and in cycle 2. And that's the table you see in front of you here. So hopefully you are familiar enough with cycle 1 to know that there are 3 video clips that we ask for. Each video clip can be up to 5 minutes. If a clip comes in longer than 5 minutes, the assessor only watches the first 5 minutes. So that's important to understand as well. But in that first video clip in step 2 of cycle 1, we need to see in the video at least 1 student and the candidate must be visible. And I just want to preface this by saying we are going explicitly by how the assessment guide was always written. It always has used the word student, sometimes with an S and sometimes without an S. If it's student with no S, then that's how we got to, we must see at least one student and the candidate. Video clip 2 is 2 or more students, 2 or more, because we use the word students with an S on it, and the candidate must be visible. In video clip 3, we need to see at least one student and the candidate must be visible. Now, these flexibilities have been put in place because of COVID. The intent of Cycle 1 was to watch a teacher candidate engage with and teach a class of students. We never defined what a number around what class was, but typically it's a group of students. Typically it was around 20 students, 25 students, 32 students. Maybe you were lucky and you had 16 students, right? But when we came into COVID and we started teaching online, we wanted to be flexible. So this is where it stands now. If you send it, if candidates send in video clip 1 with at least one student and the candidate visible, we're good to go. Same with clip 2, same with clip 3. What happens if a candidate sends in a video clip and we cannot see any students? They get a condition code. We can't score it. We need to see that synchronous interaction between a teacher candidate and their student or their students with an S. So that's an important thing to help your candidates understand. We're trying to be as flexible as we can, but these are the limits that we have to abide by. And the other thing I just wanted to say is, remember, we're only looking at the first 5 minutes of a clip and they're annotating that clip for us. So these are the guidelines around the video clips in Cycle 1. Oh, I know what I was going to say. An important point here, and we get a lot of questions about this. So again, we want to pause. Nowhere in the assessment guide did we say we had to see the absolute faces of the children or the teacher candidate. So therefore, we do not need to see faces. Is it better to see faces? Absolutely, because then we can really tell about that interchange between the teacher candidate and the children or the teenagers, right? Or the adults if it's an adult learning setting. But we don't require it. So, you know, sometimes we see videos where the students are only seen, you know, from their chin down or from the forehead up. That's fine because we can hear them and we can see the interchange. We have never said that we have to see faces. So that's just another point I wanted to clarify. And so we're going to go on now and look at Cycle 2. There are 5 clips in Cycle 2. So Zoltan, you want to walk us through that?
Right. And I think a question came up earlier about how do we get permissions for seeing students. And I think if candidates know exactly the number of students they have to have for each video clip, and I think it gives an opportunity for them to work with a few students in their classrooms and those students' parents to be agreeable to having them on camera to some degree. I think it's, you know, if I know that I have to have 2 or 3 students in a video clip, I can work to build some relationships with those students and their families to get that permission. So again, in step 2, video clip 1, we need to see 2 or more students and the candidate must also be visible. For video clip 2, 2 or more students must be visible, but we do not have to see the candidate in that clip. Video clip 3, again, is back to 2 or more students and the candidate. Clip 4, this is the one we were talking about earlier with the self-assessment. So in video clip 4, we must see the candidate modeling the self-assessment to a group of students and to give feedback to at least one student. So the candidate and at least one student must be visible here. And then video clip 5, we need to see 2 or more students and the candidate must be visible. So you're okay to have a screen of avatars as long as you have 2 or 3, or on the videos where you can have 1. If we can see 1 student for that video, that's fine. So Lori, I think we're turning this to you.
Actually, we're turning it to me,
Oh,
Zoltan.
Okay, thanks, Mary.
Oh, yeah, no worries. So I just want to take some time now in the next few slides to kind of review and provide some tips on what's acceptable and not acceptable for video requirements. So as you can see, here are some examples of candidates using the video within the platform, so that internal video that comes within the online platform. The first screen is a gallery view, and you can see the students in the screen. We don't see all the students because some of them don't have their videos on, but we do see a sufficient number who do have their videos turned on. We also see examples of the candidate screen sharing, and we see videos of the students vertical or horizontal on the screen, which is perfectly acceptable. It's not required that the candidates and students be seen at all times during the video clips. They just need to be seen at some point. This is a gallery view, but I do want you to know that speaker mode is also acceptable too, where there's only one video of the person that you see. So just so at some point, if you're in speaker mode, during the clip, we see both the candidate and the minimum number of students. So next slide, please. So this slide actually shows examples of a candidate using an external camera. Maybe they've set it up on some kind of tripod or some other type of device. But if candidates use an external camera, we just want to make sure that camera is positioned in a way that we can see the candidate and we can also see the screen. Next slide, please. So here's an example of what is not acceptable when using an external camera. You can see that the camera is just too far away. We can't see the candidate and we cannot see really a clear picture of what's on the screen. Next slide, please. And here's another example of what is not acceptable. This is an example of a small group environment. And you can see most of the students have their videos turned off and are using some type of avatar, but this is an example of what it would not be acceptable because most of the students have their videos turned off. Next slide, please. This is another example. The previous one was a small group example. This is a large group example. And upon first glance, it looks like, wow, everybody's there. Looks like a full class of students. But when you really look closely at the picture, you can see most of the videos are off, or some of them are even pointing to the ceiling where you can't see any of the students. Next slide, please. This slide is actually an example of a face-to-face. So this candidate was in the classroom, but this is also unacceptable. And I think the problem here is that the camera was set up, or the phone, for a portrait mode instead of the landscape mode, and you can only see a small view of the room. So this candidate really needed to turn their camera sideways so we could see the landscape view. Next slide. This is another example of a face-to-face, this candidate in the classroom. And in this example, you can't see any students. So again, the candidate just needs to make sure that the camera is in portrait mode instead of the horizontal landscape mode. You can go to the CTC exams website to see other tips for working in an online setting. There's general guidance as well as cycle specific and technology tips. And the link is on this slide for other information. Next slide, please. And as Amy mentioned earlier and reviewed the condition codes, we just wanted to give you the top 5 condition codes that have been assigned for cycles 1 and cycle 2. And if you notice, they are all dealing with videos. So as Amy mentioned, condition codes are assigned when submission requirements are not met. And we want to get to the point where we are not assigning any condition codes. And there is a list of all the condition codes on the CTC exams website. And when Lori goes through a walkthrough of the website shortly, we will point out where those condition codes are. This is the link to the CTC exams website, but within that website, there's a full list of condition codes. So I think I turn it over to Lori now, who will do a demonstration of the CTC exams website for you.
Thank you, Mary. So we thought we'd take some time to help everyone understand how and where they can find the CalTPA assessment materials and other resources. And we've been referring to the CalTPA website, the ctcexams.nesinc.com website, numerous times throughout today's presentation. And we're actually going to go take a look at that website now. Faculty do have access to the CalTPA assessment materials through the website, through a password protected zip file, and I'll show you where that is in just a moment. Candidates have direct access to the assessment materials when they register for a cycle. Once they've registered, they have access to the materials through the submission system. Now, programs are more than welcome to provide access to candidates, to the materials themselves. You can share the materials with your candidates. That's perfectly fine. And so next slide, please. So now we're going to go take a look at the website. I am going to switch and share my screen, James, if you can turn over controls to me. Thank you.
Yes, you have co-host privileges, so you can share now.
Perfect. All right, are we seeing the website? Okay.
Yes.
So this is the California CTC exams website. This is for all California examinations and performance assessments. And for the last year or so, this home landing page has had this giant coronavirus banner up. But if you scroll down a little bit, you can see the main landing page for the exams website. This is primarily a candidate focused website. This is where candidates come to register. This is where candidates come to upload and submit their materials. But I also think it's good for faculty to know what kind of resources are available here. So we're going to go do a quick tour and show you where different information is available. And so when you first come to this website, you need to select the assessment that you're looking for. And as you can see, all of the various CTC exams are here. The two performance assessments are near the top alphabetically. And of course, today we are talking about the California Teaching Performance Assessment. So I am going to select that option. And that brings us to the main landing page for the CalTPA. And on this main landing page, there are some basic information. There is the list of submission deadlines and reporting dates. There is typically at least one submission window every month. Some months have more than one. And candidates, when they submit by one of these submission dates, can expect to receive their results 3 weeks later, the corresponding reporting date. Also, information about fees and registration are on this page. Also information about the passing scores, which Amy and Zoltan described earlier, but those are reiterated here on this page. And a variety of other basic information about the assessment. On the right-hand side, there is a navigation menu for all of the subpages for the TPA. We're not going to take a look at all of them, but I will point out some of the highlights. On the assessment materials page, we'll go there first. I know we've had people talking about video permissions, so I want to just point out real quickly, candidates, hopefully the districts that they're in have their own video consent forms. Candidates are encouraged to use those forms first if the district that they're teaching in has their own forms on file, but if they don't, we do have sample video consent forms here that candidates can download and use if needed. The next page I want to point out is the preparation materials page. This page has a variety of information to help candidates. Resources for video recording, tips and suggestions for how to go about planning for video recording, thinking about camera angles and audio, making sure that they're setting up their camera and audio in such a way that they'll be able to capture what's going on in the room. Or of course, if they're in an online setting, some of those tips probably don't apply, but those are there should candidates need them. The next section is a handful of resources to help candidates as they prepare their video clips for upload to the Pearson ePortfolio system. There are tips for converting videos to the right file types, for compressing videos so that the file size meets the submission, the file size minimum, and other resources there. The third section has resources for using the ePortfolio system, and I want to focus on this section a little bit more. Candidates are able to come onto this website and create a registration and access the ePortfolio system. Faculty do not, but faculty can access and should help candidates to find these resources. If candidates are having trouble with the Pearson ePortfolio system, there is a guide here to using the system. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. It's very comprehensive. It's got step-by-step instructions, including screenshots. We'll scroll through this a little bit so you can see what the interface looks like that candidates are working with. And they can go through here if they've got any questions, like I said, step-by-step instructions for how they go about submitting all of their evidence. Quite a useful guide. It closed on me. There are also a couple of other resources. There is a guide for using the video annotation tool. As we spoke earlier, candidates upload their videos to the Pearson system first, and then they apply their annotations within the system. This, again, is a step-by-step guide with screenshots that can help candidates navigate the annotation tool. And then the third resource, this is actually, I believe, a 7 or 8 minute online tutorial about how to use the annotation tool. So those resources are all available on the preparation materials webpage. The next page I want to point out is the guidelines for completing the CalTPA in an online setting. As Amy pointed out earlier, when COVID hit and candidates were forced to complete their TPA in an online remote setting, the commission came up with this list of supports to help candidates understand how they can still meet the submission requirements of the CalTPA in online settings. And so there's a list of general tips and considerations, as well as cycle specific tips and considerations, and then also information about technology tips and what makes for quality learning in an online setting. So again, here is a resource for candidates if they find themselves completing their TPA in an online setting. I'm going to skip over the assessment fees and payment and alternative arrangements. You can certainly take a look at those at your leisure. I want to next go to the policies page, and specifically the assessment policies page. As we've talked numerous times throughout today's presentation about the subject of condition codes, I want to point out this is where on the website you can find a complete list of condition codes. They are listed after the complete list of submission requirements. And so candidates should read this list of requirements to make sure as they're preparing their evidence for their cycles that they are meeting all of the requirements for video, for audio. You heard Amy talk about condition codes for not providing sufficient evidence. There's an explanation for what constitutes sufficient evidence. As you scroll down the list at the bottom, if any of these submission or condition requirements are not, submission requirements are not met, here is the list of possible condition codes a candidate might receive. And so that information is available on the website. And then lastly, and probably most important for faculty, is the faculty policies and resource page. On this page, you will find, I'll stop first at acceptable supports. I believe someone earlier in the chat asked about what induction mentors are able, what kinds of supports they can provide to candidates. Well, we have a complete list of what is acceptable and not acceptable support. And so you might want to encourage your induction, your mentor teachers and other faculty to take a look at this page. It provides a pretty comprehensive list of the kinds of acceptable supports that mentors, teachers can provide, but also down at the bottom is a list of supports that would be considered unacceptable. So be sure to take some time to peruse that list. Further down on the faculty resource page, this is where faculty have access to download the actual assessment materials. They are available in password protected zip files. There's a separate file for multiple subject, single subject, and world language assessments. And these include both the guides as well as all of the templates that candidates will use to upload their cycles. I will type the password in the chat window in just a moment. I'm not very good at typing and talking at the same time, so I will do that in just a few minutes, but I want to make sure you understand this is where you have access to the assessment materials. In addition, there is a companion piece called the program guide, and this is a really handy resource for faculty. It's designed to help programs support candidates in providing information and best practices for implementing the CalTPA in your programs. And so this has got great information about the instructional strategies that pertain to the CalTPA and examples of different, for all of the different subject areas. And it's a wealth of information. So definitely download that document and take a look. And again, a variety of other resources, the links to the YouTube, excuse me. Yes, links to the YouTube channel that was mentioned earlier, as well as information for bilingual candidates completing in bilingual placements, as well as access to various CDE and CTC resources. And the last thing I want to point out down at the bottom is a section called the Secure Materials section. And here you can actually access real live sample submissions. There is a Cycle 1 multiple subject and a Cycle 2 single subject submission, mid-range submission from an actual candidate submission that you can use and share with candidates as well. And I think that covers what I wanted to show in the website. Back to you, James.
Okay, we've got some time for questions. And again, if you have specific questions about your submission, we're going to cover the different opportunities that you can join in terms of office hours and that kind of thing later. But also send emails to the CalTPA CTC website at caltpa@ctc.ca.gov. We work to get back quickly to any response or any email questions there.
It looks like the questions are about the passwords, and Lori will be putting that in, but I think looking at the time, we have 20 minutes left, so I would encourage us to maybe continue to move forward, and maybe we have some time at the end for some questions.
Okay.
Does that work?
That sounds good.
Okay.
And again, thinking about this presentation as a resource, this will go out to you. We're going to just cover very briefly the highlights of the different person-to-person supports that are available so that you can access them through the PowerPoint. So again, we have different office hours that have been mentioned throughout this presentation. You'll be able to see those on this presentation. If we continue, James, we have virtual think tanks the last Friday of the month. This next one coming up is sort of a repeat of this. It's strategies to support candidates in the induction program to complete the CalTPA. And that's next Friday. We also have, again, this lists all the different things that are available to us. We have the coordinator meetings, CalTPA coordinator meetings. Next one coming up is at the end of March, and then again in June. And once a year implementation meeting, which will be early July. And again, I'm rushing through here. Lori, did you want to take this piece?
Sure. So we've made a couple of system changes to help induction programs. The first is, as of January 19th, candidates now have the ability to log into their accounts on the CTC website and request that their performance assessment, or any of their exam scores for that matter, be sent directly via email to any third party that they choose to designate. So if you are needing your candidates to send you their score reports, they can do so. They can do so now. And so this is a way for candidates to share their reports with their induction programs. And then secondly, in just a week, or in just about a week, candidates registering for the CalTPA are required to answer a preparation program question when they register. And starting on March 1st, candidates in induction will have the ability to select a new choice, and that choice is California candidate enrolled in a commission-approved CLEAR teacher induction program. So they will now have candidates who have finished their preliminary programs and moved on will now be able to answer that registration question when they register for CalTPA.
Okay, next slide, James. Again, we've referenced this throughout the talk today, but the YouTube channel and all the resources that Lori laid out for us. Again, Deborah mentioned how comprehensive that was and that you were the thing you were looking for. So I'm glad to see this has been useful. Go to the next one. James, did you want to continue with the induction piece before we have questions and answers?
Yes, let's do that. And Karen Sacramento will be joining me as needed if she would like to jump in and add some ideas. But what we wanted to do was just bring this a little bit closer to what flexibilities and responsibilities that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought forward, but how we can make some ideas about using the information from the TPA, working with the individual learning plan or ILP for induction. So Zoltan showed us earlier, this is an example of a rubric. This is from Rubric 1.5. And what I wanted to just show you are some important elements to help mentors and candidates inform their work with induction. Where you see the red arrow are the TPEs identified for this particular rubric. TPEs standing for Teaching Performance Expectations. And as we know, the teaching performance expectations have been aligned with the California Standards for the Teaching Profession, or CSTPs, in their domains. So what this translates into for the CSTPs are CSTP2, which is creating and maintaining effective environments for learning. And then also CSTP4, which is planning instruction and designing learning experiences for all students. So the idea here is if a mentor is working with a candidate who is specifically concentrating on, let's say, Cycle 1 of the CalTPA, then the ILP could be informed from these two particular CSTP domains, that of 2 and 4. And again, this is just a suggestion. It is a way that you can correlate how the CalTPA fits very well into that of the ILP. And then the other idea here, as we had mentioned earlier, is that at the top of each rubric is a set of essential questions. These would be perfect for coaching. So if I were a coach working with a candidate, I might ask, how are you maintaining a positive and safe learning environment that supports all students to access the content-specific learning goals of your lesson? And the candidate would then share those ideas, and we would look at evidence to support that particular conversation. And then as you see in the rubric, it's all laid out right there. So the candidate can explain how that is established, how they directly connect the prior learning of content, how it fits in the unit. So all of these rubrics are available in the area that Lori just identified, and it fits very well with the ILP. The concept being, this is not added work. This is exactly what should be taking place in candidates' classrooms as they are participating in induction. Karen, did you want to add anything to that or anything that I may have missed?
I think that, it's well said. It really is the candidate's work of teaching. And in that way, the ILP for candidates who have the TPA to complete is no different than for any candidate. And the support is no different in that it is tailored to what that candidate needs. I think it's really important to keep in mind how directly the TPEs are correlated to the CSTPs and draw from that. And so the work that the candidate is doing to learn and grow around those are the activities of the ILP, and what they're doing to meet those goals, those defined and measurable outcomes of the activity around that. I mean, it just is a really natural fit. So I would just really concur with what James said in terms of that.
Thank you, Karen. And Lupe, this is rubric 1.5 for Cycle 1. So just want to answer that real quick. So the other idea that is very important in these support responsibilities is that multiple supports are expected to support candidates and programs as they work to complete their preliminary program requirements. There are a number of set of responsibilities that the commission has established through its meetings and also through its other workings through the COVID pandemic and how candidates can be supported. So if you'll see this, preliminary programs have a responsibility to support candidates as they move from the preliminary program into induction. The commission also has a number of responsibilities. You're seeing one right now where we have taken time to provide as much information as possible to assist. Candidate does have responsibilities, and it is knowing what is on your credential, what is required. Remember that any candidate, this is the professional requirement that you have, that you are required to complete when you hold a credential in the state of California. Employers also have responsibilities with regard to providing support, and that does vary from district to district. And then finally, each induction program does have responsibilities in working with mentors and candidates around what requirements are needed to be fulfilled. There are a number of existing flexibilities that have been provided in one page. You can see that what commission took action in April of 2020, the executive order that was provided by the governor in May of 2020, and then it was extended in a rider with the budget for SB 820. Please know that the executive order currently is extended through August of this year. We have no knowledge of an extension that will have to be determined by the legislature and or the governor, but at this time we do not have any indication that this will be extended. Also information about the letter that was signed by the State Board of Education, the Commission, and the California Department of Education, which was about strengthening partnerships through the work of candidates and student teachers. And then finally, there's a series of ongoing support structures that exist through webinars, conferences, virtual think tanks, which are all published weekly in the PSD e-news. So now we're going to talk about upcoming events, and I believe, Zoltan, I'm going to turn it back to you. The last thing I would like to add is that all of these items are on the Commission's main page. So if you go to ctc.ca.gov, the green banner at the top of the Commission's webpage is where you can find all this information. And I will put that into the chat. Oh, Amy already did. Thank you.
Okay, and again, I'm going to go quickly through this in the interest of time, but you'll be able to reference this on the presentation. So we are having upcoming CalTPA Spring Assessor trainings for folks who would like to become assessors, and here are the dates for those. We just this last weekend had a marathon of training a group of new assessors. So you can see where those are if you're interested. We've got the future submission deadlines, which this is a reproduction of what Lori showed us on the website as well. And then we will put the description here for next week's virtual think tank, but it's going to be similar to this. It's supporting candidates in completing their CalTPA, folks that are in the induction programs.
Zoltan, just it's this Friday. I know time is slipping by quickly. It's this Friday. It's the last Friday of the month, and February is a short month, so
yes,
February ended before it started.
And I think I just want to add that the date should be February 26th, I believe is Friday's date.
Okay.
Just want to make sure.
We'll correct this on the presentation. Thank you. All right, we're at the end and we have some time, a few minutes for questions.
I know there's a candidate who would like to come to candidate office hours. So Lori or James, will you please put in the chat again how John can reach us during candidate office hours so he can ask us some more follow-up questions. That would be helpful. How about anyone else? Other questions that we can help you with today?
Phoebe has a question, Amy, and she asks, is each CalTPA assessed by only one reviewer, or are they assessed by more than one person?
Yeah, that's a great question. It just, typically it comes into the system, it gets sent to the appropriate calibrated assessor. So either a Cycle 1 multiple subjects assessor, a Cycle 2 multiple subjects assessor, or a single subject assessor. And of course, only assessors who have the matching credential and expertise can score a submission. So I want to make sure that everyone's aware of that. If you hold a credential to teach single subject physics, for example, and there's a physics submission that comes in, then it would be routed to that specialist in that content area. So the submission comes in, it gets routed to the assessor scores it, 1. If there's any kind of complication, the assessor can escalate it to another set of assessors that we call lead assessors, who engage in reading the submission and making those decisions about condition codes if that's appropriate. So sometimes submissions are scored or at least reviewed by more than one person. And there are random checks. So throughout all the submissions coming in, submissions are selected for second readings to make sure that we're staying calibrated and to make sure that all candidates are scored equitably and fairly and consistently from submission to assessor. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does,
and
but
it is
also
a 3-week turnaround. So from the date of the window closing for that assessment period, then there's a 3-week turnaround for it to be scored and gotten back to the candidate, the program, and the commission on the same day after that 3 weeks passes.
I'm sorry,
James.
Amy. She
Go
does have a follow-up question. Does the same assessors review both Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 from the
No, they do not.
Right.
They're separate groups, and it's really important. These are complex instructional assessments, as you can tell after today's presentation. So assessors specialize in Cycle 1 or in Cycle 2 in the elementary level. And then in the single subject level, those assessors do score both Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 at the lead level, but not at the assessor level.
The next question, I think, Karen, you might be able to answer. It's about a crosswalk between the TPEs and the CSTPs. Is there a document?
I don't believe we have a public document that does this, but certainly if you look at what the candidate is working on, the domains are the same. So the 6 domains are the same, Allison. And within those domains, there's a high level of comparability across the elements. So it's a pretty easy correlation to make as you're looking at the what the candidate is focusing on for the TPA and within the TPEs, and then how that fits into the CSTPs. The TPEs are designed to be looked at a more preliminary level, but really the main difference is that the TPEs are more robust because they're more recently validated. So they just kind of expand on the CSTPs. So it really is, I've been able to quite easily go between the 2 documents, and I wasn't that familiar with the TPEs to start. So if you have a candidate, it should be pretty clear in terms of how the mentor would work with them.
There's a follow-up question with regard to how, you know, a more specific example of an ILP with the TPA. And I can start here first, Karen. It really depends on the candidate's needs. You know, we always want the candidate to be the one who identifies the CSTPs that he or she wishes to work on. However, what I would recommend is that it is a process that the mentor, the induction program, and the candidate collaboratively works on. in order to produce the most accurate ILP that can assist the candidate. And remember that ILPs are meant to be revisited often, and they change as the needs of the candidate changes. So it is really going to be a document that is always evolving due to what the candidate is needing assistance with. And as we have seen, it changes every day, it changes every week. I don't know, Karen, if you want to add something else to that, but I just thought as a fairly recent induction director, that's where I would go.
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. And it is really important to sit with the fact that passing the performance assessment is not the goal in the ILP. The goal is whatever activities that candidate is working on that are TPE/CSTP related, that moves the candidate in that direction. So in that way, again, it's very aligned to what candidates are completing an induction who don't have extra requirements to do. Those support, the support and those resources, James had a page on different resources that the mentor's receiving, that the candidate is also then, getting support and resources around. That's the process and path for the IOP support activities. So again, passing the summative assessment, that is not the goal, but whatever the candidate is doing around that, that's how that would be integrated into the ILP.
Okay, we are at 5 o'clock. There is a meeting evaluation, and I will put that into the chat. We do invite you to please participate with this meeting evaluation, because it really helps us as the people who put the information together to know how it is that we are able to support you and give you the information that you need. It should only take you about 2 minutes, or are only 5 questions. And what I'm going to do is turn it back to Zoltan so I can actually get that into the chat. So Zoltan.
Okay. Yes, and we've been referencing this throughout the presentation again today. So there are different emails to address different kinds of questions. For technical questions, es-caltpa@pearson.com is the place to go. Policy questions, caltpa@ctc.ca.gov. And then the examinations website is there. We really appreciate all the questions that you've posted. Again, really welcome you to the office hours. I find those to be very dynamic places where people are getting information, but also sharing strategies and information as well. So we hope you can join us and possibly see you at the think tank this Friday. Amy?
Great. Yes. Thank you all for being with us. We hope that if you do have questions, you will reach out and talk with us directly. We're trying to provide lots of avenues for communication. And if you have any ideas about how we can better support you or different ways that we can support you, we would really appreciate you letting us know that as well, because we're here to help. And we want to make sure that you're all feeling comfortable with receiving candidates into induction that need to complete their TPA. And it is all to our benefit to work together here to help these candidates. So please, please, please reach out to us and check out our YouTube channel, because there's lots of information that we've been archiving there over this past year that could be very helpful as well. So again, thank you for all you're doing to support candidates. We know it's been a tough year, and we're looking forward to the light at the end of the COVID tunnel here, and hoping that we're going to be back in classrooms and with students and back in teaching environments that are a little bit more like what they were a few years ago. But we have learned a lot in this past year, and we hope we continue forward to apply what we have learned about teaching in online settings. So with all of that, I'll just wrap it up again and say thanks. And thanks to our partners at ES for joining us today. And thank you to Karen for being with us today, and to James and Zoltan. So
thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Just a quick final word. If you're not sure that you're registered and you want to receive this presentation, just drop a line to the CalTPA@ctc.ca.gov email, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of it.